I never thought my own flesh and blood would stand in church and condemn me to hell. But there she was, my daughter Abigail, pointing her finger at me from the pulpit, her voice thundering through the sanctuary. There are fathers who refuse to serve God, who deny their possessions to the Lord and therefore are destined for hell. Yes, to hell. All because I refused to give her $10,000 for a church van. What I didn't know then, as I walked out with every eye in the congregation burning into my back, was that the church accountant had just discovered something shocking. Over $200,000 in donations missing, and a trail of evidence leading straight to Abigail. Even worse, I'd soon find my own name forged on accounts I never opened. My identity stolen by the daughter I sacrificed everything to raise. But the most devastating revelation was still waiting for me in a powder blue box hidden in my late wife's closet. A secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved with your whole heart, if you've ever wondered how to find forgiveness when the wounds cut too deep, or if you've struggled to understand how the person you raised could become a stranger, my story might help you find your way. Make sure to follow this channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This is a journey you won't want to miss. That Sunday, the sun burned the back of my neck as if hell itself was already waiting for me. I was sitting in the third row of the church as I had been doing for months, trying to understand what had happened to my daughter. Abigail stood at the altar, dressed in white as if she were a saint, holding the microphone with one hand and a Bible with the other. Behind her, her husband, the associate pastor, gave me a cold stare as if I were an intruder. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when my Abigail would run to me with skinned knees and tear-filled eyes, seeking comfort only I could provide. I'd worked 60-hour weeks at the automotive plant for 35 years to give her everything. College, her wedding, even the down payment on their first house. My calloused hands were testimony to a father's love. But something changed 3 years ago when she and Robert joined this new church. Slowly, my sweet Abby transformed into someone I barely recognized, someone who looked at me with disappointment shadowing her eyes, as if my very existence was a burden to bear. It was then that she looked at me. In the middle of her sermon, she stopped talking about grace and pointed her finger directly at me. There are fathers who refuse to serve God, who deny their possessions to the Lord and therefore are destined for hell. Yes, to hell. All eyes turned toward me. She knew exactly what she was doing. This was punishment for me saying no when she asked for $10,000 to buy a van for the church. I had just paid for my medical bills. Triple bypass surgery doesn't come cheap even with insurance. The money she wanted was nearly all I had left from my retirement fund. The sanctuary fell silent. I could feel the weight of judgment from the congregation pressing down on me like a physical force. Some people whispered to each other. Others just stared. The elderly woman next to me actually slid several inches away. "The Lord sees those who hold their earthly treasures above his kingdom," Abigail continued, her voice rising with each word. "And what awaits such people? What does the good book say?" She paused dramatically. "The wages of sin is death." My hands trembled as I clutched my worn Bible. 50 years of faith, of tithing what little I could spare, of volunteering at soup kitchens and homeless shelters, all erased with a single sermon from my own flesh and blood. I stood and walked out without saying a word. The floor seemed to slip away beneath my feet. It was as if my daughter had spat on everything I had built with sacrifice and buried me alive in front of a congregation. The parking lot was blistering hot when I emerged. My 2001 Buick, the one I'd kept running through sheer stubbornness and YouTube repair videos, sat alone in the far corner. As I fumbled with my keys, I noticed Robert's BMW parked in the special church leadership spot, gleaming in the sun. The same Robert who'd come to me 6 months ago, hat in hand, asking for help with their mortgage payment. I drove home to my empty house, the same 3-bedroom ranch where I'd raised Abigail after her mother died of cancer. Photos of her lined the hallway. Abigail at her high school graduation, Abigail on her wedding day, Abigail holding her infant son, my grandson, whom I was now only allowed to see on approved visits. The phone rang just as I settled into my recliner. It was Howard Mason, the church's accountant. His voice sounded strained, almost fearful. "Mr. Thompson, I think you should come back to the church. There's something you need to see." "Howard, after what just happened, I don't think—" "It's about the donations," he interrupted. "Specifically the Mission 70x7 project donations." My heart sank. I had donated $5,000 to that mission project last year. Money meant to build a medical clinic in Guatemala. It was the largest single donation I'd ever made, in memory of my late wife who had always wanted to serve as a medical missionary. What about them? I asked, though something in his tone told me I already knew. There are discrepancies, significant ones. He lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. And Mr. Thompson? They all lead back to Abigail. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I never imagined that, on that very day while I was being stoned with stares, the church accountant would discover a massive financial hole, and that this hole led straight to her. Even worse, I had no idea that within hours I would discover my name on documents I'd never signed. Documents that made it look like I was her accomplice. God help me. I didn't know my own daughter anymore, and I certainly didn't know what she was capable of. That same afternoon, my phone rang again as I sat in my living room, still reeling from the morning's events. The number displayed was Pastor Richards, and my thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I finally answered. His voice trembled as he spoke, lacking all the booming confidence I'd heard from the pulpit just hours earlier. Mr. Thompson, William, I need you to come to the church. Private matter. Urgent. The way he emphasized private sent a chill down my spine. I arrived at Abundant Life Community Church 20 minutes later. The parking lot that had been full during the morning service was now empty except for Pastor Richard's modest sedan and Howard Mason's pickup truck. The church building looked different somehow. Less majestic, more ominous as shadows stretched across its white stucco exterior in the late afternoon sun. Pastor Richards met me at the side entrance, his usual immaculate appearance now disheveled. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and sweat stained the underarms of his dress shirt despite the air conditioning that hit me as I stepped inside. "This way," he mumbled, leading me not to his public office where he received visitors but to the smaller administrative office behind the sanctuary, the room where the church's financial matters were handled. Howard sat hunched over the desk, papers spread across its surface like fallen leaves. He barely looked up when we entered, just nodded slightly in acknowledgement. His glasses sat low on his nose and the overhead fluorescent light reflected off his balding head as he continued to sort through documents. "Sit down, William," Pastor Richards said, gesturing to a chair across from Howard. I lowered myself slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the movement. The pastor remained standing, pacing back and forth in the small space, his footsteps creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking wall clock. "We've found some irregularities," Howard finally spoke, his voice clinical, detached. He pushed a stack of papers toward me. "These are bank statements for the Mission's 70x7 project." I looked down at the documents. Numbers swam before my eyes, large sums transferred into and out of accounts. But what caught my attention was a highlighted transaction, $45,000 transferred to a personal account linked to a business credit card. "What am I looking at?" I asked, though the knot in my stomach told me I already knew. "Over the past 18 months, Howard replied, adjusting his glasses, approximately $217,000 has been diverted from church donations, primarily from the Mission's 70x7 fund. Pastor Richards stopped pacing. "William, this is difficult, but we have evidence that Abigail has been misappropriating funds." My mouth went dry. "That's not possible. There must be some mistake." Howard shook his head and placed another document before me. "This is a statement for the business credit card linked to the account where the money was transferred." He pointed to various lines on the statement. "Five-star hotel stays in Las Vegas, gourmet restaurants, designer boutiques, a $12,000 deposit for a Mediterranean cruise scheduled for next month." The room seemed to tilt as I studied the evidence. Each receipt bore Abigail's signature, that distinctive swirl I'd seen countless times on birthday cards and Christmas presents. My mind flashed to Robert's BMW, their newly renovated kitchen, the designer clothes Abigail now wore to services. "There's more," Pastor Richards said, his voice dropping even lower. He nodded to Howard, who hesitantly slid another document across the desk. It was a bank statement for a joint account, an account bearing both Abigail's name and mine. "I don't understand," I whispered, my fingers trembling as they touched the paper. "I don't have an account with my daughter. I've never. It was opened 3 years ago," Howard explained, his tone gentle now, almost pitying. "Shortly after she and Robert joined the church, Pastor Richards pulled out a chair and finally sat down, his shoulders slumped. William, I need to ask you directly. Did you know about this? Were you involved in any way? The accusation hit me like a physical blow. No, God is my witness, I knew nothing about this account. This is the first I'm seeing any of this. Something in my face must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. I believe you, William, but the police might not be so easily persuaded. This looks bad. Howard cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's something else you should see. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Abigail left this in her desk before she disappeared this morning. We haven't opened it. I recognized my daughter's handwriting immediately. The elegant script that had once filled thank you notes and school essays. My name was written on the front, with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, just 3 lines. Dad, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. You never understood what it takes to build something meaningful. You'll understand soon enough. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. This wasn't a confession or an apology, it was a taunt. Where is she? I asked, my voice hollow. Pastor Richards exchanged a glance with Howard. We don't know. She led this morning's service, then told the secretarial staff she had an appointment. No one has seen her or Robert since. I carefully folded the note and returned it to the envelope, the weight of what was happening finally settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. My daughter, my only child, had not only stolen from the church but had somehow implicated me in her crime. And now she had vanished. What happens now? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. We've contacted the police, Pastor Richards said softly. They'll want to speak with you. I nodded, too numb to argue or protest. As I stood to leave, Howard placed his hand on my arm. William, there's one more thing. The account in your name? Nearly $80,000 of the stolen funds passed through it. I left the church in a daze, the afternoon sun now hidden behind gathering storm clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, an ominous warning of what was to come. I barely remember driving home from the church that evening. The windshield wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm against the rain that had finally broken from the threatening clouds. Each flash of lightning illuminated my reflection in the rearview mirror, a man I hardly recognized, with hollow eyes and deepening lines of worry. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in my recliner until dawn, surrounded by photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of Abigail as a gap-toothed 7-year-old playing softball, her high school graduation, where she'd hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack, her wedding day when I'd walked her down the aisle with her mother's locket pinned inside her dress, close to her heart. Where had that girl gone? When had she become this stranger who could look me in the eye while condemning me to hell? Who could steal from a church and frame her own father? As the first light of morning filtered through my blinds, I made a decision. I needed answers, and I knew where to start. I showered, dressed in my best button-down shirt and slacks, and drove to First National Bank on Main Street. The bank had just opened when I arrived. The lobby smelled of fresh coffee and floor polish, with its marble counters and potted palms attempting to convey prosperity and security. I approached the receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile who directed me to a customer service representative named Melissa. Melissa's office was small but neat, with framed certificates on the wall and a small potted succulent on her desk. She greeted me with practiced warmth, gesturing for me to take a seat in the chair opposite her desk. "How can I help you today, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, hands poised over her keyboard. "I need information about an account," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "A joint account that apparently bears my name, though I never opened it." Her smile faltered slightly. "Do you have the account number?" I handed her the statement Howard had given me. She studied it briefly, then typed something into her computer. The soft clicking of keys filled the silence as I waited, hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide their trembling. "This account was opened 3 years ago," she said finally, looking at her screen. "It shows both your signature and that of Abigail Roberts. That's the problem." I leaned forward. "I never signed anything. I didn't know this account existed until yesterday." Melissa's professional demeanor shifted subtly. She glanced toward her office door before lowering her voice. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting identity fraud?" "I'm not suggesting it, I'm stating it plainly. That's not my signature and I never authorized this account." She nodded slowly, then turned her monitor so I could see it. "This is the account application form that was submitted. Is this your signature?" I put on my reading glasses and studied the document. The signature was a reasonable facsimile of mine, but certain details were wrong. The loop on the P was too rounded, the crossing of the T too high. After signing countless permission slips, checks, and tax forms over the decades, I knew my own handwriting. "No," I said firmly. "That's not my signature." Melissa's expression became grave. "I'll need to escalate this to our fraud department immediately. This is a serious matter, Mr. Thompson." "How serious?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Bank fraud is a federal offense," she replied, her voice professional but sympathetic, "especially when it involves substantial sums of money." She turned her screen back and continued typing. "I see multiple transactions through this account over the past 3 years. Large deposits followed by transfers to other accounts or credit card payments." My knees suddenly felt weak, even though I was sitting down. "Can you tell where the money came from and where it went?" She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "The deposits appear to be from an organization called Abundant Life Community Church, mostly electronic transfers. The withdrawals went to various credit cards, retail establishments, and—" She paused, squinting at the screen. "Something called Coastal Luxury Rentals." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. Coastal Luxury Rentals. I remembered Abigail mentioning last Christmas that she and Robert had been blessed with a timeshare opportunity on the Gulf Coast. A special deal, she'd said, through connections at the church. Melissa must have noticed my distress. "Mr. Thompson, are you all right? Would you like some water?" I nodded mutely and she stepped out briefly, returning with a paper cup of cold water that I drank gratefully. The cool liquid helped clear my head, though it did nothing for the ache in my chest. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the same question I'd posed to Pastor Richards the day before. "We'll launch a formal investigation," Melissa explained, her tone gentle but firm. "You'll need to fill out some paperwork declaring the fraud. Our security team will review all transactions on the account and gather evidence. Given the nature of this situation, we'll likely need to involve law enforcement." The weight of it all pressed down on me. My daughter hadn't just stolen from the church. She'd stolen my identity, used my good name to launder money, made me an unwitting accomplice to her crimes. "Will I be held responsible for this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Melissa's expression softened. "If we can verify your claim, prove that your identity was stolen, then no. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Thompson. These investigations can be lengthy and complex." I filled out form after form, signing each with my true signature, the one that had signed Abigail's report cards, her college tuition checks, her wedding gift. Each stroke of the pen felt like another nail in a coffin I never imagined I'd build, the death of trust between father and daughter. When I finally left the bank 2 hours later, the morning sun had risen high and bright, mockingly cheerful against the darkness of my thoughts. I sat in my car in the parking lot, unable to start the engine, paralyzed by a realization that cut deeper than any knife. The Abigail I'd raised, the little girl who once sat on my shoulders at the county fair, the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak, the young woman who'd danced with me at her wedding, that Abigail was gone. Perhaps she'd never really existed at all. I drove home with the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest, making each breath painful. When I finally reached my house, I walked straight to the mantelpiece where a small framed photo stood. Abigail and her mother, taken just months before cancer took my wife. I turned it over, and there, written in my wife's delicate handwriting, was a message I'd forgotten. The truest hearts sometimes break the hardest. Love anyway. That night, as the clock on my nightstand ticked past midnight, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the picture of Abigail and her mother. The message on the back, "The truest hearts sometimes break the hardest, love anyway," had unlocked something in my memory. There was something else Martha had left behind, something I'd nearly forgotten in the 15 years since cancer took her. "If a day comes when you don't understand," she'd whispered during those final days in hospice, her voice as thin as tissue paper, "look in the blue box." I hadn't thought about that blue box in years. After Martha died, I'd packed away most of her things, unable to bear the constant reminders of her absence. Some items went to charity, others to her sister in Oregon, but the most personal belongings, the ones that held our shared history, I'd stored in the attic, tucked under the eaves where the summer heat baked the roof tiles and dust gathered undisturbed. My joints protested as I pulled down the folding attic stairs. The wood creaked beneath my weight as I climbed, flashlight in hand, into the darkness above. The beam cut through years of settled dust, dancing with particles that swirled in its path. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of old paper and forgotten things. I made my way carefully between stacked Christmas decorations and boxes labeled in my own handwriting. Martha Kitchen, Martha Books, Martha Winter Clothes. Each cardboard container held fragments of a life cut short, of plans never realized, of a future we'd never share. And then, pushed back against the chimney stack, I found it. A powder blue hat box with a ribbon around it, exactly as Martha had left it. I blew off a layer of dust, revealing the faded flower pattern on its lid. With trembling hands, I carried it down to the living room like it contained something fragile and precious. I set it on the coffee table and just stared at it for several minutes. What secrets had Martha kept from me? What answers could possibly be in this box that would explain what our daughter had become? Finally, I untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, along with newspaper clippings, a small journal bound in faded leather, and a USB drive that looked out of place among these analog keepsakes. The first letter I picked up was addressed to Abigail, dated just after her 10th birthday, but the return address made my blood run cold. James Morrison, Lakewood Correctional Facility. I knew that name. James had been a missionary our church had supported years ago before he was killed in a bus accident in Colombia. At least that's what we'd all been told. With a growing sense of dread, I opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in a neat, precise hand. My dearest Abigail, I hope this letter finds you well. I think about you every day and wonder if you've grown taller, if you still love horses, if you've mastered that piano piece you were struggling with when I last saw you. Your mother sends me photos when she can, though I know she must be careful. One day when you're older, she promises you'll know the truth about me. Until then, know that not a day passes when I don't think of you. All my love, your father. Your father. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I reached for another letter, then another, each one addressed to Abigail, each one signed by James Morrison, each one referring to himself as her father. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the journal. Martha's handwriting filled the pages. Intimate thoughts, secret meetings, a relationship that had continued long after James had supposedly died. And then, on a page dated 7 months before Abigail was born, a single line that shattered my world completely. I can't tell William the baby isn't his. It would destroy him. James agrees we must protect William from the truth. He is a good man who will be a loving father. The room spun around me. I'd raised Abigail from birth, changed her diapers, taught her to ride a bike, helped her with homework, walked her down the aisle. For 35 years, I'd been her father in every way that mattered, except by blood. I reached for the USB drive with numb fingers. It seemed so out of place among these decades-old secrets. Whatever it contained had been added to the box much more recently. I went to my desk and plugged it into my laptop, waiting as the ancient machine hummed to life. A single folder appeared labeled AR Sessions. Inside were audio files, each dated within the past 2 years. With a sense of foreboding, I clicked on the most recent one. Abigail's voice filled the room, but not the Abigail I knew from Sunday sermons. This voice was raw, unfiltered, filled with emotion I hadn't heard from her in years. Dr. Winters, I found out the truth when I was 16. Mom was already sick then. I found the letters in her dresser while looking for her insurance card. All those years living a lie. Do you know what that does to someone? To discover your entire identity is built on deception? A softer voice responded, presumably Dr. Winters. And you never confronted your mother or William about this? Mom was dying. What was I going to do? Make her last months even more painful? And William? He doesn't know. He still doesn't know. Sometimes I look at him and all I can see is the lie. Yet you continued to accept his support, his love. A bitter laugh. His support. His love. Do you know what real love is, doctor? It's truth. Everything else is just convenience. And the church funds? How does that fit into your search for truth? A long pause before Abigail answered. Divine justice works in mysterious ways. The faithful are just stepping stones. And William is the biggest fool of all. God uses the foolish to shame the wise, doesn't he? Isn't that what Scripture teaches us? I stopped the recording, unable to bear another word. My chest felt hollow, as if something vital had been scooped out. The girl I'd raised, the woman I'd loved as my daughter, saw me as nothing more than a fool to be used. A stepping stone, a convenience. I sat there in the darkened living room, surrounded by the physical evidence of decades of deception. Martha's, James's, and now Abigail's. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, but the darkness inside me only seemed to deepen. The blue box had answered one question but raised 100 more. And somewhere out there, Abigail was running, perhaps believing I'd never discover the truth, never understand the depth of her contempt for me. She was wrong. The reckoning was coming as surely as that sunrise outside my window, and when it did, neither of us would ever be the same. 3 weeks passed in a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. The local paper ran the story on page 3. Church funds missing, associate pastor's wife wanted for questioning. By the following week, it had made the front page. Church embezzlement tops $200,000. Pastor's daughter and husband flee state. I became a reluctant celebrity in our small town of Millfield. At the grocery store, conversations would halt when I walked down an aisle. Former friends from church crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. My neighbor of 17 years stopped bringing over her Thursday night casseroles. Then came the call I'd been both dreading and waiting for. Detective Morales, the lead investigator on Abigail's case, phoned me on a Tuesday morning. "Mr. Thompson, we found them." His voice was professionally neutral, giving away nothing. "A rental house outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Local police picked them up without incident." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. Is she all right?" A pause. "They're fine. In custody, but fine. They'll be extradited back to Arizona within the week." I thanked him and hung up, then sat in my recliner staring at the wall for hours. My daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager who'd played clarinet in the high school band, the young woman I'd walked down the aisle, was coming home in handcuffs. The courthouse was an imposing sandstone building that had stood on Main Street since 1912. I'd passed it thousands of times but had never had reason to enter its hushed corridors until now. The marble floors echoed with every footstep as I made my way to courtroom C for the arraignment. I sat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous, despite the whispers and stares. Pastor Richards nodded grimly from across the aisle, looking a decade older than he had a month ago. Howard Mason, the accountant, sat beside him, clutching a briefcase that I knew contained damning financial records. The side door opened and Abigail entered, escorted by a female deputy. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. She was thinner than I remembered, her cheekbones more pronounced. But what struck me most was her bearing. Head held high, shoulders back, her walk more of a runway strut than a prisoner's shuffle. She'd applied makeup perfectly, her hair styled as if for church rather than court. She wore a modest navy dress that somehow managed to look both pious and expensive. Robert followed behind her, his usual confident smile replaced by a haunted look. Unlike his wife, he seemed diminished, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, dark circles shadowing his eyes. As Abigail took her seat at the defense table, her gaze swept the courtroom. When her eyes met mine, a small smile curved her lips, not the warm smile of a daughter seeing her father, but something cooler, almost triumphant, as if to say, "See what I've become? See what I've done?" The judge entered and we all rose. Judge Harmon was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wasted no time with pleasantries, moving efficiently through the charges. Grand theft, embezzlement, fraud, identity theft, money laundering. "How do the defendants plead?" she asked, peering over her reading glasses. Abigail's attorney, a sleek man in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension, stood. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." Judge Harmon nodded, making a note. "Bail?" The prosecutor, a young woman with the determined look of someone with something to prove, approached the bench. "The state requests bail be denied, Your Honor. The defendants have already demonstrated flight risk by leaving the state when the investigation began. Additionally, we have reason to believe they have access to substantial hidden funds." Abigail's attorney argued passionately about community ties, lack of prior criminal history, and the supposedly circumstantial nature of the evidence. Throughout it all, Abigail sat perfectly still, her posture impeccable, her expression serene. Only the slight tapping of her manicured fingernails on the table betrayed any tension. When the judge set bail at $500,000 each, I saw Robert flinch. Abigail didn't react at all. As the deputies prepared to escort them back to holding, Abigail's attorney approached me in the gallery. "Mr. Thompson, a word, please." His voice was smooth as polished marble. "My client would like you to know that she's prepared to implicate you as a co-conspirator, unless you agree to testify on her behalf." The blood drained from my face. "What?" He adjusted his tie, seemingly uncomfortable but pressing forward. "She has documentation suggesting your involvement. Bank accounts in your name, transfers you allegedly authorized. It would be your word against hers." "But that's," I sputtered, "that's blackmail. And those documents are forgeries. I've already filed reports with the bank." He shrugged, a practiced gesture of professional detachment. "Nevertheless, that's her position. Think about it." He handed me his card and walked away, leaving me standing there, stunned and shaking. As Abigail was led past me toward the door, she turned slightly. "Daddy," she said, just loud enough for me to hear, her voice a perfect mimicry of the little girl she once was. "You always taught me to fight for what I believe in." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Those 14 days were among the longest of my life. I met with the prosecutor, sharing everything I'd found in Martha's blue box, including the USB drive with Abigail's therapy sessions. The young prosecutor, Sarah Jenkins was her name, listened with growing amazement as the recordings revealed Abigail's contempt not just for me, but for the entire congregation she'd helped her husband lead. "This is unusual evidence, Mr. Thompson," Ms. Jenkins said carefully. "I'm not sure how admissible the therapy recordings will be given confidentiality laws, but it certainly establishes motive and state of mind." The day of the hearing arrived with a punishing summer heat that shimmered above the courthouse steps. Inside, the air conditioning was cranked so high that I shivered as I took my seat in the witness box. From there, I could see the back of Abigail's head, her honey blonde hair arranged in an elegant twist that reminded me painfully of her mother. Ms. Jenkins led me through my testimony methodically. My discovery of the fraudulent accounts, the forged signatures, the threatening message from Abigail's attorney. Throughout it all, I could feel Abigail's eyes on me, cold and calculating. When the prosecutor played excerpts from the therapy recordings, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Abigail's voice, clinical and detached, described her congregation as sheep waiting to be fleeced, and her husband's ministry as the perfect cover. For the first time, Abigail's composure cracked. She turned in her chair, facing me directly, her eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen before. In that moment, she didn't look like my daughter at all. She looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The trial lasted 11 days. 11 days of testimony, evidence, cross-examination, and sidelong glances from jurors who couldn't quite believe that a woman who looked like she belonged on a church bulletin could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme. 11 days of watching my daughter transform into someone I didn't recognize, sometimes playing the role of the devoted Christian woman wrongfully accused, other times the shrewd businesswoman who had simply been managing church investments creatively. Robert cracked on the 4th day. His attorney negotiated a deal. He would testify against Abigail in exchange for reduced charges. I watched from my usual spot in the back row as he took the stand, refusing to meet his wife's gaze. "It was Abigail's idea from the start," he testified, his voice barely audible until the judge asked him to speak up. "When we joined Abundant Life, she saw how loosely the finances were managed. She said it was—" He paused, swallowing hard. "She said it was God's way of providing for us." Abigail sat perfectly still during his testimony, her face a mask of betrayal. Only the white-knuckled grip on her pen revealed her fury. When Robert described how she had forged my signature on the bank documents, using old financial papers she'd taken from my filing cabinet during a holiday visit, I saw her jaw clench briefly before the mask slipped back into place. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning their verdict. I sat in that courtroom surrounded by former friends and church members as the 4 women stood to deliver the decision that would determine Abigail's fate, and in many ways my own. On the count of grand theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. Abigail didn't flinch. She stood ramrod straight, staring directly ahead as the judge thanked the jury for their service. It was only when the bailiff approached to escort her from the courtroom that she finally turned and looked at me. In that brief moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not remorse or shame, but something more complicated. Something that looked almost like relief. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The courtroom was less crowded this time. The story had lost its novelty. Newer scandals had captured the town's attention. Pastor Richard sat next to me, his hand occasionally patting my shoulder in awkward sympathy. "William," he said quietly as we waited for proceedings to begin. "The church board met yesterday. We voted to close Abundant Life. Too much damage has been done. Trust is broken beyond repair." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The church where I'd worshipped for 30 years, where I'd married Martha, where we'd baptized Abigail. Gone. Another casualty of my daughter's actions. Judge Harmon sentenced Abigail to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 2 years. Robert received 18 months, mostly already served in county jail awaiting trial, plus 3 years of supervised probation. The church would receive restitution, though everyone knew it would never recover the full amount stolen. "This court cannot undo the damage you've done to your community," Judge Harmon told Abigail, her voice stern. "Nor can it heal the special betrayal you've inflicted on your father. That burden is yours to carry." Abigail showed no reaction. As the bailiff led her away, she didn't look back at me, not even once. I left the courthouse feeling oddly hollow. There was no triumph in her conviction, no satisfaction in seeing justice served, just an emptiness where family should have been. The days afterward passed in a fog. I declined interviews from local reporters and ignored the casseroles that suddenly reappeared on my doorstep from neighbors who had shunned me during the investigation, but now viewed me with sympathetic curiosity. I spent hours sitting in my garden, watching bees move from flower to flower with purpose I couldn't seem to muster for myself. A month after the sentencing, I received a letter. The return address was the Arizona State Women's Correctional Facility. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it with trembling fingers. The letter wasn't what I expected. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness. Instead, it read like one of Abigail's sermons, filled with scripture references and talk of divine justice. She wrote about earthly courts versus heavenly judgment, about the corruption of worldly institutions, about her own persecution for financial innovations that would have been celebrated in corporate America. "Men like you," she wrote in her elegant handwriting, "will never understand what it takes to truly change the world. You live small, think small, dream small. I refuse that limitation. God doesn't call us to mediocrity or contentment. He calls us to glory, to abundance, to victory. The world calls it crime. God calls it destiny." It went on for 3 pages, her handwriting growing more emphatic, the pressure of her pen leaving indentations on the cheap prison stationery. She concluded with a final barb. "You may think you've won, that justice prevailed, but I answer to a higher authority. One day, you'll understand that I was right all along. Until then, I'll pray for your limited understanding to expand." She signed it not as my daughter, not as Abigail, but as Reverend A.R. Roberts, a title she'd apparently given herself. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Then I sat on my porch swing, the same swing where I'd once rocked infant Abigail to sleep on summer evenings just like this one. The mockingbird that nested in my maple tree sang its evening song, cycling through borrowed melodies as shadows lengthened across the lawn. The community remained divided in the aftermath. Some people, mostly former church members, crossed the street to avoid me, as if my daughter's crimes were somehow contagious. Others made a point of engaging me in conversation at the grocery store or post office, their voices loud and deliberately friendly, performing compassion for an audience of onlookers. I found myself withdrawing more and more, preferring the company of my garden and my books to the complicated dance of small-town sympathy and judgment. The solitude wasn't entirely unwelcome. For the first time in decades, I had space to consider who I was beyond the roles that had defined me. Worker, husband, father, churchgoer. At night, I sometimes dreamed of Abigail as a child, her small hand in mine as we walked through autumn leaves. In these dreams, she would look up at me with complete trust, her eyes full of a love I now questioned had ever been real. I would wake from these dreams with wet cheeks and an ache in my chest that no amount of morning coffee could wash away. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself rereading Martha's journal from the blue box. Beyond the revelation of Abigail's paternity, There were entries about our life together, small moments I'd forgotten, daily joys and struggles recorded in my wife's neat handwriting. In one entry dated shortly before her diagnosis, Martha had written, "William loves so completely, so unquestioningly. It's his greatest strength, but I fear it may someday be his greatest vulnerability." She had seen what I couldn't. And somehow, knowing that Martha had understood this about me was both painful and strangely comforting. 2 years passed slowly, marked by changing seasons and quiet holidays spent alone. I developed new routines. Tuesday mornings at the community center where I taught woodworking to troubled teens. Thursday afternoons volunteering at the local literacy program. Sunday mornings tending my garden instead of sitting in a pew. Small acts that helped fill the void left by church and family. I received occasional updates about Abigail from Sarah Jenkins, the prosecutor who had somehow become something of a friend. Abigail had become a model prisoner, leading Bible studies and mentoring younger inmates. She'd even started a program to help incarcerated mothers maintain relationships with their children. Classic rehabilitation narrative, Sarah commented during one of our infrequent coffee meetings. The cynical part of me wonders if it's genuine or just another performance. She studied my face carefully. "Have you thought about visiting her? She's eligible for parole soon." I had thought about it, more than I cared to admit. The question haunted my quiet evenings. What would I say to the daughter who had betrayed me so completely? What could either of us possibly say to bridge such a chasm? The decision came to me one morning as I stood in my garden, watching a monarch butterfly emerge from its chrysalis, a perfect metaphor for transformation that seemed almost too on the nose in its timing. That afternoon, I called the prison and arranged a visit for the following week. The Arizona State Women's Correctional Facility was a complex of low, beige buildings surrounded by layers of chain-link fence, topped with coils of razor wire. The October sky above was an intense, almost painful blue that contrasted sharply with the drabness below. I joined the line of visitors, mostly women with children, a few elderly couples, waiting to be processed through security. The visitation room was large and institutional, with bolted-down tables and chairs arranged in neat rows. Vending machines hummed along one wall, offering overpriced snacks and sodas. Guards stood at strategic points around the perimeter, their expressions professionally neutral but watchful. I sat at an assigned table, hands resting on its smooth surface, trying to control their slight tremor. Around me, emotional reunions played out in miniature dramas, tearful embraces, children climbing onto laps, couples holding hands across tables with an intensity that spoke of long separation. And then she was there. Abigail had lost weight. The prison uniform, a shapeless beige jumpsuit, hung loosely on her frame. Her hair, once honey blonde and always perfectly styled, had darkened to a more natural light brown and was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Without makeup, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, more like the girl I had raised. She hesitated when she saw me, something flickering across her face. Surprise, uncertainty, before the practiced mask slipped into place. She approached the table with measured steps and sat down across from me, hands folded neatly in front of her. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. Her voice was different, softer, lacking the performative quality I'd grown accustomed to in recent years. "Neither did I admitted. We sat in silence for a long moment. Around us, other families chatted, laughed, shared news and gossip. Our quiet felt conspicuous in comparison. "You look thin," I finally said, a ghost of a smile. "Prison food, not exactly five-star cuisine." Another silence stretched between us. I noticed a small scar near her left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. I wanted to ask about it, but wasn't sure I had the right anymore. "Robert remarried," she said suddenly. "Did you know? Some girl from his new church in Texas, 23 years old." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "He sent me divorce papers 6 months after sentencing, cited irreconcilable differences." I hadn't known. Robert had disappeared from Millfield immediately after his release, leaving behind whispered stories and unpaid debts. "I'm sorry," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. She shrugged, a gesture that was both dismissive and wounded. "It's fine. We weren't." She trailed off, then met my eyes directly for the first time. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I actually believed it. All of it. The divine right to prosperity. The idea that God wanted us to have everything. That taking from the church was just redistributing blessings. She looked down at her hands. I convinced myself it wasn't stealing. It was claiming what was rightfully ours as God's chosen servants. I didn't know how to respond to this unexpected confession. We sat in silence again, but it felt different now, less hostile, more contemplative. "Did you get my letter?" she asked. "Yes." I was still angry when I wrote it, still convinced I was right. She traced a pattern on the table with her fingertip. I've had a lot of time to think since then. I watched her face, searching for signs of the manipulative woman who had stood in court, head high, unrepentant. Instead, I saw someone both familiar and strange, my daughter, but changed in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. "You still think I'm your daughter?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course she knew. The blue box, the therapy recordings, all of it had come out during the trial. The DNA evidence that proved what Martha's journal had revealed, that James Morrison was Abigail's biological father. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing echoes of Martha in the curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes, but also seeing the stranger who had condemned me from a pulpit, who had stolen my identity along with the church's money, who had tried to frame me for her crimes. "Does it matter?" I asked finally. "Does blood matter more than all those years? The nightmares I soothed, the tears I wiped away, the proudest moments we shared?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was thick with emotion I hadn't heard from her in years. "I hated you," she said quietly. "When I found out, I hated that my whole life was built on a lie, that the man I called Daddy wasn't really mine." She swallowed hard. "It was easier to hate you than to admit how much I'd loved you. How much I still—" She couldn't finish the sentence. I reached across the table, an instinctive gesture, but stopped short of touching her hand. "Prison rules. It doesn't matter what the blood says," I told her, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions in my chest. "I was your father every day you cried in my arms, every day you laughed, every day you lived under my roof. DNA doesn't change that." For the first time since she was a small child, I saw Abigail cry without calculation, without performance. Just raw, human tears that carved silent paths down her cheeks. She made no move to wipe them away, as if accepting their presence was part of some necessary penance. I stood up, suddenly unable to bear the weight of everything between us. The love, the betrayal, the years lost, and the uncertain future ahead. From my pocket, I pulled an apple, bright red and perfectly shaped. I placed it on the table between us, a peace offering of sorts, a reminder of the lunches I'd packed for her throughout her school years. "I should go," I said. She nodded, still not trusting herself to speak. As I turned to leave, she finally found her voice again. "Will you come back?" she asked. Hope and fear mingled in the question. I paused, not turning around. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I'm glad I came today." The sunlight outside the prison was almost blinding after the fluorescent lighting of the visitation room. I walked to my car slowly, feeling lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged I was carrying. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if Abigail's remorse was genuine, or if she would return to her old ways upon release. I didn't know if we could ever rebuild any kind of relationship from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But for the first time in 2 years, I allowed myself to hope, not for a perfect reconciliation or a fairy tale ending, but for the possibility that something new and honest might grow from the painful truth we had finally acknowledged. 6 months after my visit to the prison, on a crisp April morning that smelled of rain and new beginnings, I received a call from Sarah Jenkins. Abigail's parole hearing had been successful. She would be released the following week. "She listed your address as her residence upon release," Sarah said, her tone carefully neutral. "I wanted to make sure you were aware. You have every right to refuse." I sat on my porch swing, phone pressed to my ear, watching a pair of robins build a nest in my maple tree. Spring had come early that year, as if nature itself was impatient for renewal. "I haven't decided yet," I told her honestly. "You have 3 days to notify the parole board if you're unwilling to provide housing," Sarah reminded me gently. "Otherwise, they'll assume consent. 3 days to decide whether to open my home to the daughter who had tried to destroy me. 3 days to weigh forgiveness against self-preservation. 3 days to determine if the fragile reconnection we'd experienced in the visitation room was genuine or another manipulation." I didn't call the parole board. When the day of Abigail's release arrived, I wasn't at the prison gates to meet her. Instead, I left the spare key under the flower pot on the porch, made up the guest bedroom with fresh linens, stocked the refrigerator, and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away. I left a note on the kitchen counter. "The house is yours to use while you get back on your feet. Take the time you need. I'll be back in a week." I needed space, to think, to prepare myself for whatever version of Abigail would emerge from those prison gates. And perhaps she needed space too, freedom to re-enter the world without the weight of my expectations or fears. When I returned home 7 days later, the house was immaculate, cleaner than I'd left it, in fact. The guest bedroom showed signs of use: neatly made bed, a well-worn Bible on the nightstand, a hairbrush on the dresser. But Abigail herself was nowhere to be found. On the kitchen counter where I'd left my note was another: "Thank you for the shelter. I found a small apartment near the community college. Starting classes next month. I won't burden you with my presence. A." Beneath the note was a set of house keys and a bright red apple. I stood in my silent kitchen, turning the apple in my hands, feeling both relieved and strangely disappointed. It seemed Abigail had made her choice, to rebuild her life apart from mine. Perhaps it was for the best. Perhaps some wounds were too deep for proximity. Life settled into new rhythms. I continued my volunteer work, expanded my garden, joined a hiking group that explored the desert trails every Saturday morning. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets about Abigail through the small-town grapevine. She was working part-time at a bookstore, taking classes in social work, volunteering at a women's shelter. She kept to herself, they said. Quiet, different. I never saw her around town, though Millfield was small enough that our paths should have crossed eventually. I came to suspect she was deliberately avoiding places I frequented: the hardware store on Main Street, the coffee shop near the community center, the farmer's market on Sunday mornings. Then one Wednesday morning, I stepped onto my porch to retrieve the newspaper and found a red apple sitting on the railing, perfect and polished, like something from a fairy tale. I looked around, but the street was empty in the early dawn light. The following week, another apple appeared, and then another the week after that. Never a note, never a sign of the visitor who left this curious offering. But I knew. Something in me recognized this ritual for what it was. Not quite an apology, not quite a reconciliation, but an acknowledgement, a tenuous thread connecting us across the chasm of what had happened. I began leaving things in return. A paperback book I thought she might enjoy, a small carved wooden bird I'd made in my workshop, a jar of honey from my newly established beehives. These offerings would disappear, replaced by the weekly apple, an exchange conducted without words or direct contact. Months passed this way. Seasons changed. The ritual continued. Then one autumn evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and gold, I was pruning my rose bushes when I sensed, rather than heard, someone at the garden gate. I turned to find Abigail standing there, a tote bag over one shoulder, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, dressed in jeans and a faded blue sweater that made her look younger than her 37 years. "I brought apples," she said, holding up a small basket of fruit. "From the farmer's market. They're better than the supermarket ones." I set down my pruning shears and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Would you like some tea? The mint is fresh from the garden." She nodded, and I led her to the porch where 2 rocking chairs faced the garden. We sat in comfortable silence as I poured tea from a thermos I'd prepared earlier. The evening air was cool, but not cold, fragrant with the scent of late-blooming roses and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. "I graduated last week," she said finally. "Associate's degree in social work. I'm transferring to the State University in January to complete my bachelor's." "Congratulations," I said, meaning it. "That's quite an achievement." "I'm working with women transitioning out of prison," she continued, her voice gaining confidence, "helping them find housing, employment, reconnect with their families when possible." She took a sip of tea. "I understand them. The shame, the fear of rejection, the struggle to believe you can be more than your worst mistakes." I studied her profile in the fading light, seeing echoes of the little girl who once sat on these same porch steps sorting her Halloween candy, the teenager who sprawled in the yard with textbooks during spring finals, the young woman who announced her engagement on this very porch. But I also saw someone new, someone tempered by consequences, humbled by failure, strengthened by the hard work of rebuilding. "Why the apples?" I asked, the question that had lingered for months finally finding voice. She smiled slightly, her gaze fixed on the garden. Do you remember when I was 7 and I broke your fishing trophy? The one you won at Lake Powell? I nodded. The crystal trophy had been a source of disproportionate pride, my one athletic achievement in a life of modest accomplishments. I was so afraid you'd be angry, she continued. But you just sat me down and gave me an apple. You said everyone makes mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that matters. She turned to look at me directly. You taught me about making amends before I even knew what the word meant. Something tight in my chest loosened at her words. Not everything had been a lie. Not every lesson had been rejected. Something of the father I'd tried to be had taken root after all. I can't undo what I did, she said quietly. I can't give back the years or erase the pain I caused, but I can acknowledge it. I can try to live differently now. She set her teacup down carefully. The apples are my way of saying I remember who you tried to raise me to be, even when I fought against it with everything I had. We talked until stars appeared in the darkening sky, catching up on small details of our separate lives. There were still boundaries between us, careful edges we didn't cross. We didn't discuss the trial or her time in prison. We didn't mention Robert or the church that had closed its doors. We were building something new and fragile that couldn't yet bear the weight of all our history. As she prepared to leave, I walked her to the garden gate. You don't have to leave apples anymore, I told her. You could just come for tea, maybe Sunday afternoons? She hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. Today, every Sunday, we sit on that porch and talk about books, gardening, her studies, my woodworking. Simple things, safe things. But occasionally, when the moment feels right, we venture into deeper waters. Careful conversations about forgiveness, identity, the nature of love and family. I don't see Abigail as often as I might see a daughter who had walked a different path. Our relationship isn't what it might have been without the betrayal and pain that divided us. But each week, she brings an apple, and each week, I accept it. And that's enough. Not to forget, but to remember that even when love is thrown into the fire, it doesn't burn away completely. It remains, glowing like embers, waiting for the right breath to kindle it back to life. Not the same as before, but alive nonetheless. They say the deepest wounds come from those we love the most. When my daughter stood in that church and condemned me to hell, I never imagined the journey that would follow. Discovering her theft, learning she wasn't biologically mine, watching her walk into prison, and finally finding that small red apple on my porch every week. A silent testament that even when betrayal burns through the fabric of family, something can still remain in the ashes. What would you do if someone you'd given your whole life to betrayed you so completely? Would you close the door forever, or leave a key under the flower pot? The hardest lesson I've learned is that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating space for something new to grow beside the scars. My relationship with Abigail will never be what it once was, but perhaps it's becoming something more honest, more real than the fantasy we both clung to for so many years. The apples keep appearing on my porch and I keep accepting them. Not because I've forgotten, but because I've chosen to remember that love, even when thrown into the fire, doesn't completely burn away. It remains like embers, waiting for the right breath to kindle it back to life. If this story touched you in any way, please consider following this channel for more stories of redemption and human resilience. Like and share if you believe that second chances, however imperfect, are worth giving. After all, we're all just one decision away from needing one ourselves.